Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we'll continue with readings from the Thurber Carnival by James Thurber. Memoirs of a Drudge. Mr. Thurber went to Ohio State University for his formal education. His informal education included drudgery on several newspapers in Columbus, in New York, and in Paris. From Horse Sense in American Humor by Walter Blair. I don't know about that. There is, of course, a certain amount of drudgery in newspaper work, just as there is in teaching classes, tunneling into a bank, or being President of the United States. I suppose that even the most pleasurable of imaginable occupations, that of batting baseballs through the windows of the RCA building, would pall a little as the days ran on. Seldom, it is true, do I gather my grandchildren about my knees and tell them tall tales out of my colorful years as a legman, but I often sit in the cane-seated rocker on the back porch, thinking of the old days and cackling that glee known only to aging journalists. Just the other evening, when the womenfolk were washing up the supper dishes and setting them to drain, they could hear me rocking back and forth and laughing to myself. I was thinking about the Riviera edition of the Chicago Tribune in southern France during the winter of 1925 and 26. 7 or 8 of us had been assigned to the task of getting out the little 6-page newspaper whose stories were set up in 10-point type instead of the customary 8-point to make life easier for everybody, including the readers. Most of our news came by wire from the Paris edition, and all we had to do was write headlines for it, a pleasurable occupation if you were not rushed, and we were never rushed. For the rest, we copied from the Éclair du Nice et Sud-Ouest, a journal filled with droll and mystical stories whose translation, far from being drudgery, was pure joy. Nice, in that indolent winter, was full of knaves and rascals, adventurers and impostors, pochards and indiscrets, whose ingenious exploits, sometimes in full masquerade costume, sometimes in the nude, were easy and pleasant to record. We went to work after dinner and usually had the last chronicle of the diverting day written and ready for the linotypers well before midnight. It was then our custom to sit around for half an hour making up items for the society editor's column. She was too pretty, we thought, to waste the soft southern days tracking down the arrival of prominent persons on the Azure coast. So all she had to do was stop in at the Roule and the Negresco each day and pick up the list of guests who had just registered. The rest of us invented enough items to fill up the last half of her column, and a gay and romantic cavalcade indeed, infested with the littoral of our imagination. Lieutenant General and Mrs. Pendleton Gray Winslow, we would write, have arrived at their villa, Heart's Desire, on Cap d'Antibes, bringing with them their prize Burmese monkey, Thibaut. Or, the Honorable Mr. Stephen H.L. Atterbury, charge d'affaires at the American Legion in Peru, and Mrs. Atterbury, the former Princess Ling of Tibet, are motoring to Monte Carlo from Aix-en-Provence, where they have been visiting Mr. Atterbury's father, Rear Admiral A. Watson Atterbury, USN, retired. Mr. Stephen Atterbury is the breeder of the famous Schnauzer Pinscher champion Adelbert von Wiegengross of Tamerlane, said to be valued at $15,000. In this manner, we turned out in no time at all, and with the expenditure of very little mental energy, the most glittering column of social notes in the history of the American newspaper, either here or abroad. At the hour of midnight, when it struck, in accordance with the dreamy custom of town and church clocks in southern France, and our 4 or 5 hours of drudgery were ending, the late Frank Harris would often drop in at the Tribune office, and we would listen to stories of Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, Bernard Shaw, Emma Goldman, and Frank Harris. Thus ran the harsh and exacting tenor of those days of slavery. It is true that the languorous somnolence of our life was occasionally broken up. This would happen about one night a week around 10 o'clock when our French composing room went on strike. The printers and their foreman, a handsome black-bearded giant of a man whose rages resembled the Mistral, wanted to set up headlines in their own easygoing way, using whatever type size was handiest and whatever space it would fit into most easily. That is the effortless hit or miss system which has made a crazy quilt of French newspaper headlines for 200 years, and Andre and his men could not understand why we stubbornly refused to adopt so sane and simple a method. So, now and then, when we couldn't stand our stupid and inviolable headline schedules any longer, Andre would roar into our little city room like a storm from the Alps. Behind him in the doorway stood his linotypers with their hats and coats on. Since the Frenchman could comprehend no English and spoke only Niçois, an argot entirely meaningless to us, our arguments were carried out in shouting and gesticulating and a great deal of waving of French and American newspapers in each other's faces. After a while, all the combatants on both sides would adjourn to the bar next door, still yelling and gesturing, but after 4 or 5 rounds of beer, we would fall to singing old Provençal songs and new American ones, and there would be a truce for another 6 or 7 days, everybody going back to work, still singing. On one of those nights of battle, song, and compromise, several of us defenders of the immutable American headline went back to the bar after we had got the Tribune to press and sat up till dawn, drinking grog américain. Just as the sun came up, we got on a train for Cannes, where the most talked about international struggle of the year was to take place that afternoon, the tennis match between Suzanne Le Glen and Helen Wills. As we climbed aboard, one of my colleagues, spoiling for an argument, declared that a French translation he had read of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven was infinitely superior to the poem in the original English. How we had got around to this curious subject, I have no idea, but it seemed natural enough at the time. I remember that a young reporter named Middleton visited all the compartments on the train, demanding of their sleepy and startled French occupants if they did not believe that a raven was more likely to say jamais plus than never more. He returned with the claim that our fellow passengers were to a man passionately on the side of jamais plus. So passed a night of drudgery in the fond, faraway days of the Third Republic and the Riviera edition of the Chicago Tribune. We had the long days of warm blue weather for our own, to climb the Corniche roads or wind up the mountain in a char-a-banc to the magical streams and the million springtime flowers of Saint-Martin-Vesubie. Sometimes we sat out on the terrace of the restaurant overlooking the Bay of Angels and gave the tireless Albert suggestions as to where he might find Henry James. Albert was a young Englishman who did interviews for us with distinguished visitors to the Riviera, and he had got the curious idea that the celebrated novelist was hiding away in a pension somewhere between Saint-Tropez and Menton, rewriting The Golden Bowl. We decided that Albert had got his tip about the whereabouts of the great dead man from some aging aunt who lived in parlors and gardens of the past. It was one way to spend an afternoon, sitting over our glasses of vermouth, bringing back to life the poor sensitive creator of Peter Quint and Madame de Vionnet, figuring him lost and wandering ever so wonderfully somewhere among the bougainvillea and the passion flowers. Thus, in fancy and in dream, we passed the long days of warm blue weather. Before going to France, I worked on the Columbus Evening Dispatch, a fat and amiable newspaper whose city editor seldom knew where I was and got so that he didn't care. He had a glimpse of me every day at 9 a.m., arriving at the office, and promptly at 10 he saw me leave it, a sheaf of folded copy paper in my pocket and a look of enterprise in my eye. I was on my way to Marzetti's, a comfortable restaurant just down the street, where a group of us newspapermen met every morning. We would sit around for an hour, drinking coffee, telling stories, drawing pictures on the tablecloth, and giving imitations of the more eminent Ohio political figures of the day, many of whom fanned their soup with their hats, but had enough good old-fashioned horse sense to realize that a proposal to shift the clocks of the state from Central to Eastern Standard Time was directly contrary to the will of the Lord God Almighty, and that the supporters of the project would burn in hell. After this relaxing and often stimulating interlude, I would stroll out to the Carnegie Library and read the New York World in the periodical room. It so happened that the city offices, which I was assigned to cover, were housed at that time in the library building, the old city hall having burned down the first night I ever attended a council meeting in it. After I had put the world back on its rack, only a little fragment of forenoon remained in which to gather the news, but I somehow managed the aggravating chore. Nor were the city offices dull and colorless places. Secretary Killam of the Civil Service Commission had a tuba on which I learned to play a few notes, an exciting and satisfying experience, as anyone who has brought forth a blast from a tuba knows. The lady dance hall inspector was full of stories of the goings on in the more dubious clubs about town, in one of which, she reported, the boys and girls contrived to two-step without moving their feet. And the mayor's office was frequently besieged by diverting and passionate taxpayers. An elderly gentleman who could get KDKA on the steel rims of his spectacles, a woman who warned of the approach of earthquakes by a sharp twinge in her left side, and a lady to whom it had been revealed in a vision that the new O'Shaughnessy storage dam had not been constructed of concrete, but of cream of wheat. So ran the mornings away in the years of my servitude on the Columbus Dispatch. The afternoons, after 3 o'clock, I had to myself. I used to spend a great many of them at home, lying down. That tuba took quite a little out of me. Now we come to the 6 months of drudgery on the New York Evening Post, back in the days of Sacco and Vanzetti, the Hall Mill case, and Daddy Browning. The city editor of the paper, a gentleman with a keen eye for the frailties of men and a heart overflowing with misericordia, apparently decided I did not look like a man capable of handling spot news, that is, events in the happening, such as warehouse fires and running gunfights. He therefore set me to writing what he called overnight feature stories. These were stories that could be printed anytime, tomorrow or next week, or not at all, if the flow of important news was too heavy. They were designed to fit in between accounts of murder trials and train wrecks to brighten the ominous page and lighten, if possible, the uneasy heart of the reader. So it came about that when other reporters were out wearing themselves down in quest of the clangorous and complicated fact, I could be observed wandering the quiet shore above the noisy torrent of contemporary history, examining the little miracles and grotesqueries of the time. I wrote only one story a day, usually consisting of fewer than 1,000 words. Most of the reporters, when they went out on assignments, first had to get their foot in the door, but the portals of the fantastic and the unique are always left open. If an astonished botanist produced a black evening primrose, or thought he had produced one, I spent the morning prowling his gardens. When a lady in the West 70s sent in word that she was getting messages from the late Walter Savage Landor in heaven, I was sent to see what the importunate poet had on his mind. On the occasion of the arrival in town of Mayor Monroe of Jacksonville, Florida, who claimed to be 117 years old, I walked up Broadway with him while he roundly cursed the northern dogs who jostled him, bewailed the while the passing of Bob Lee and Tom Jackson and Joe Johnson. I studied gypsies in Canarsie and generals in the Waldorf. I listened to a man talk backward and watched a blindfold boy play ping pong. Put it all together, I don't know what it comes to, but it wasn't drudgery. It was not often in the Post or no Strum and Drang phrase that I wandered farther afield than the confines of greater New York. On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Washington's crossing of the Delaware, however, I was sent over to Trenton to report the day-long celebration. Once in a long while, I got a spot news assignment like that. At a little past 10 in the morning, I discovered the hotel room which a group of the more convivial newspaper men had set up as their headquarters, and at a little past 12, I was asleep in a chair there. When I woke up, it was dark, and the celebration was over. I hadn't sent anything to my paper, and by that time it was too late. I went home. The Post, I found out, had used the Associated Press account of what went on in Trenton. When I got to work the next morning, the city editor came over to my desk. "Let's see," he said, "what did I send you out on yesterday?" "It didn't pan out," I told him. "No story." "The hell with it then," he said. "Here, get on this. Lady says there are violets growing in the snow over in Red Bank." "Violets don't grow in the snow," I reminded him. "They might in Red Bank," he said. "Slide on over there." I slid instead to a bar and put in a phone call to the chief of police in Red Bank. A desk sergeant answered, and I asked him about the violets. Ain't no violence over here, he told me, and hung up. It wasn't much to hang a story on, as we say, but I hung one on it. But first, I had a few more drinks with a man I had met at the bar, a very pleasant fellow, captain of a barge or something. Shortly after the strange case of the violets in the snow, I left the newspaper game and drifted into the magazine game. And now, in closing, I wish to leave with my little readers, both boys and girls, this parting bit of advice: stay out of the magazine game. Recollections of the Gas Buggy. Footnotes to an era for the future historian. Now that the humorous magazines have taken to printing drawings of horses rearing at the sight of an automobile and of children exclaiming as a car goes by, "What is that thing, Mama? Mama, what is that thing, huh, Mama?" It is perhaps not out of place to prepare some small memorial in advance of the passing of the motor car. It appears to have reached on its way backward to oblivion what corresponds roughly to the year 1903. I think that no one has drawn a darker or more vivid picture of the approaching doom of the gas engine than Mrs. Robertson, the aged washerwoman whose prophecies and pronouncements I have the privilege of listening to every Monday morning. Mrs. Robertson is, for my money, an extremely sound woman, although admittedly my judgment of soundness has sometimes been questioned. Some of the opinions of Mrs. Robertson, which I recall offhand, are these: if you don't pay no mind to diseases, they will go away. The night was made partly for rest and partly as a punishment for the sinful. And the government only allows you to keep furniture for 2 months. This last conviction grows out of Mrs. Robertson's habit of buying furniture on the installment plan and failing to keep up her payments longer than 6 or 7 weeks, with the result that the things are repossessed. She looks upon this recurring ritual in her domestic life as a form of federal taxation. Mrs. Robertson's beliefs and feelings about the future of the automobile, which I have been leading up to, go like this: the oil supplies of the world are being dried up in order to prevent future wars. This will also put an end forever to pleasure driving, but that is all right because if people kept on riding in cars, they would soon lose the use of both legs and the life of man would pass from the earth. If Mrs. Robertson is right in her predictions, I should like to set down my own few unique experiences with gas-driven vehicles before I forget them. They may possibly serve as footnotes to the work of some future historian, lightening a little the dolorous annals of the automobile. Let me admit to begin with that the automobile and I were never in tune with each other. There was a fundamental incompatibility between us that amounted at times almost to chemical repulsion. I felt the headlights of an automobile following me the ways the eyes of a cat follow the ominous activities of a neighbor's dog. Some of the machines I have owned have seemed to me to bridle slightly when I got under the wheel. Neither the motor car nor myself would greatly mourn if one of us were suddenly extinguished. Years ago, an aunt of my father's came to visit us one winter in Columbus. She enjoyed the hallucination, among others, that she was able to drive a car. I was riding with her one December day when I discovered to my horror that she thought the red and green lights on the traffic signals had been put up by the municipality as a gay and expansive manifestation of the Yuletide spirit. Although we finally reached home safely, I never completely recovered from the adventure and could not be induced after that day to ride in a car on holidays. When I got an automobile of my own and began to drive it, I brought to the enterprise a magnificent ignorance of the workings of a gas engine and a profound disinterest in its oily secrets. On several occasions, worried friends of an engineering turn of mind attempted to explain the nature of gas engines to me, but they succeeded only in losing me in a mechanical maze of terminology. I developed the notion that the gas engine was more soundly constructed than I was. I elaborate this point only to show you on what unequal terms the motor car and I were brought together. Out of my long and dogged bouts with automobiles of various makes, there comes back to me now only one truly pleasant experience. There may have been others, but I doubt it. I was driving in the British Isles in 1938 and came one day to a sudden coughing stop in a far and lonely section of Scotland. The car had run out of gas in the wilderness. This car's gasoline gauge had a trick of mounting toward full instead of sinking toward empty when the tank was running low, one of many examples of pure cussedness of which it was capable. There I was, miles from any village, with not even a farmhouse in sight. On my left was a thick woods, out of which the figure of a man suddenly appeared. He asked me what was the matter, and I said I had run out of petrol. It just happens, he told me, that I have a can of petrol. With that, he went back into the woods and came out again with a 5-gallon can of gasoline. He put it in the tank for me. I thanked him, paid for it, and drove on. Once, when I was telling this true but admittedly remarkable story at a party in New York, a bright eyed young woman exclaimed, "But when the man emerged from the lonely woods, miles away from any village, far from the nearest farmhouse, carrying a 5-gallon can of gasoline, why didn't you ask him how he happened to be there with it?" I lighted a cigarette. "Madam," I said, "I was afraid he would vanish." She gave a small laugh and moved away from me. Everybody always does. Another experience I had in England the same year helped to shake the faith of at least one Briton in the much vaunted Yankee affinity for machinery. The battery of my car had run down in a village about 20 miles from York, my destination. I put in a call to a garage, and a young mechanic showed up presently in a wrecking car. He said he would give me a tow for a few yards. I was to let the clutch in and out, or out and in, whichever it is, and start the engine that way. It is a device as old as the automobile itself, and years before I had managed it successfully. Any child or old lady can do it. So he attached a rope to the back of his car and the front of mine, and we were off. I kept letting the clutch out and in, or in and out, madly, but nothing happened. The garage man kept stopping every 500 yards or so and coming back to consult with me. He was profoundly puzzled. It was farther than he'd ever dragged a car in his life. We must have gone in this disheartening manner about a third of the way to York. Finally, he got out for the 7th time and said to me, "What gear have you got her in?" I didn't have her in any gear. I had her in neutral. She had been in neutral all the while. Now, as any child or old lady knows, you have to have her in gear. If she is in neutral, it is like trying to turn on the electric lights when there are no bulbs in the sockets. The garage mechanic looked at me with the special look garage mechanics reserve for me. It is a mixture of incredulity, bewilderment, and distress. I put her in low gear. He gave me a short haul, and she started. I paid him, and as he drove off, I could see him in the rearview mirror, standing in the road, still staring after me with that look. After I had got back to America, safe and sound, to the surprise of my friends, I produced this same expression on the face of a garage man in Connecticut one afternoon. I had driven the same car from Newton to Litchfield on a crisp October day. It happened that I was just getting over an attack of grip and still running a temperature of a couple of degrees. The car, out of plain deviltry, began to run 1-2. The red fluid in the engine gauge on the dashboard started to rise alarmingly. It got to the point marked danger. I drove into a garage at a pretty jumpy state of mind. A garage man looked at the gauge and said the thermostat was clogged or something of that kind. I was standing outside the car, staring at the dashboard and its, to me, complicated dials, when I noticed to my horror that one of them registered 1,560. I pointed a shaking finger at it and said to the mechanic, "That dial shouldn't be registering as high as all that, should it?" He gave me the same look I had got from the man in England. "That's your radio dial, Mac," he said. "You got her set at WXQR." I got into the car and drove home. The garage man stared after me until I was out of sight. He is still probably telling it around. My temperature rose a degree that night, and I developed a theory about automobiles. The thing possessed, I decided, a certain antic intelligence akin to that of a 6-month-old poodle. It had run a temperature that afternoon out of mischief and mockery because I was running one. It had deliberately betrayed me in the Scottish wilderness that other afternoon by running its gasoline gauge toward full instead of empty. I began to wonder what I had done to the car to arouse its malice. Finally, I put my finger on it. The car had probably never forgiven me for an incident that had occurred at the border between Belgium and France one day in 1937. We had stopped at the Belgian customs on our way into France. The customs man leaned into the car, glanced at the mileage recorded on the speedometer, and said something in French. I thought he said I would have to pay 1 franc for every kilometer the car had traveled. I was loudly indignant in French and in English. The car had gone about 35,000 miles. I figured this out in kilometers and it came roughly to 55,000. Changing that figure into francs and then into dollars, still loudly and angrily, I estimated I would have to pay about $1,800 to the Belgian customs. Customs man kept trying to get a word in, and so did my wife, but I roared on in my peroration. I shouted that the car had not cost one half of 1,800 when it was new, and even then it hadn't been worth a third of that. I announced I would not pay as much as $50 to drive the car into Oz or Never Never Land. Jamais, jamais pays. The engine, which had been running, stopped. The customs man finally got in a word. Dismissing me as obviously insane, he spoke to my wife. He shouted that he had said nothing about $1,800 or even $8. He had simply made some small comment on the distance the car had gone. As far as he was concerned, we could drive it to Jamais, jamais pays and stay there. He turned on his heel and stalked away, and I started the motor. It took quite a while. The car was acting up. The night my fever rose, I thought I knew why. It had resented the slighting remarks I had made about its value and had determined to get even with me. It got even with me in more ways than I have described. Whenever I tried to put chains on a tire, the car would maliciously wrap them around a rear axle. If I parked it 10 feet from a fire plug and went into a store, it would be only 5 feet from the plug when I came out. If it saw a nail in the road, the car would swerve and pick the nail up. Once, driving into a bleak little town in the Midwest, I said aloud, I'd hate to be stuck in this place. The car promptly burnt out a bearing, and I was stuck there for 2 days. If Mrs. Robertson is right in her prophecy and the gas engine is really on the way out, it will be no dire blow to me. I will move within roller skating distance of a grocery, a drugstore, a church, a library, and a movie house. If the worst comes to the worst, I could even walk. Thank you.